In 1962, a mobster slapped Bumpy Johnson's wife in broad daylight on 125th Street. 11 minutes later, Bumpy made one phone call that didn't involve guns, threats, or violence. What arrived at that mobster's family home 72 hours later forced an entire crime family to their knees. What could terrify a man more than his own death? 125th Street wasn't silent that afternoon. It held its breath. The Harlem sun burned high at 1:15, casting hard shadows across fruit stands where vendors called out prices in rhythms older than the neighborhood itself. Bus brakes hissed. Someone's radio played Sarah Vaughan. The smell of roasting peanuts mixed with gasoline and that particular heat that makes asphalt shimmer like water. It was the kind of Tuesday where nothing should happen, where men in summer suits walked slow and women fanned themselves with folded newspapers. Vincent Vinny Slick Terranova didn't belong there, and everyone knew it the moment he stepped onto that corner. He wore his ambition like cheap cologne. Too strong, announcing itself before he entered a room. A soldier in the Lucchese family, barely 32, with the kind of hunger that made older men nervous. He'd been collecting from numbers runners on the edge of Harlem for 6 weeks, pushing boundaries his superiors never explicitly authorized, but never explicitly forbid. Mamie Johnson was buying peaches, 3 pounds, firm but not hard, the way Bumpy liked them. She'd been married to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson for 16 years and understood more about power than most men who carried guns. She knew which streets you could walk and which required an arrangement. She knew that respect wasn't given. It was demonstrated daily through 1,000 small acknowledgments. The collision was almost choreographed in its inevitability. Vinny turning the corner too fast. Bourbon still warming his blood from a lunch that ran long. Maymee stepping back from the fruit stand with her paper bag. The bump was minor. What happened next wasn't. "Watch where you're going," Vinny said, his hand already moving before his brain caught up. The slap connected with Mamie's cheek. Not hard enough to knock her down, but loud enough that the sound carried across that sun-bleached street like a gunshot. For exactly 3 seconds, 125th Street experienced something it hadn't felt in years. Complete silence. The fruit vendor's hand froze mid-reach. 2 men playing dominoes stopped arguing. Even the traffic seemed to pause, as if the city itself understood that something fundamental had just broken. Mamie didn't cry out. She didn't stumble. She simply straightened her hat with one hand, picked up her bag of peaches with the other, and looked at Vinny with eyes that had seen the empires rise and fall. "You just made a choice," she said quietly, each word measured and final. "You don't know what it cost yet, but you will." Vinny laughed, the sound harsh and performative, playing to an audience that wasn't there. "Tell Bumpy if he's got a problem. He knows where to find me." He walked away like a man who'd just won something, his shoulders squared with a confidence that would last exactly 11 more minutes. The street vendor, an old man named Cecil, who'd sold fruit on that corner for 23 years, would later tell investigators that what frightened him wasn't the violence itself. Violence was common, expected, even. What frightened him was watching Mamie Johnson walk away with perfect composure, her spine straight as a verdict. Because he'd seen that particular kind of calm before. It was the stillness that came right before everything changed. The quiet moment when decisions got made that would echo for years. By the time Mamie reached the corner of Lenox Avenue, 3 different people had already made phone calls. The network that kept Harlem functioning, that invisible web of loyalty and information, had activated with the speed of a nervous system responding to a burn. Nobody had to explain the severity. Everyone understood that certain lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. In Harlem, There were rules older than any organization chart. You didn't touch another man's family. You didn't bring violence into daylight where children could see. And you absolutely, under no circumstances, put your hands on Mamie Johnson, not because she was fragile, but because she was protected by something more dangerous than muscle. She was protected by respect, by reputation, by the accumulated weight of decisions her husband had made over 30 years of building power, one calculation at a time. Vinny Slick walked another block before the bourbon confidence started to fade, replaced by something else. A small voice in the back of his mind asking a question he couldn't quite silence. In that neighborhood, on that street, surrounded by people who'd seen him slap that woman. Why had nobody moved? Why had nobody helped him? Threatened him, or even looked at him directly? The silence wasn't fear of him. It was something else entirely. It was pity. In Harlem, some actions take 1 second to commit but spend a lifetime collecting their debt. Bad news travels faster than violence ever could. Small's Paradise sat on 7th Avenue like a jewel box, its exterior modest, its interior a cathedral of low light and high stakes. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the club belonged to accountants and quiet conversations. The kind of business that happened in daylight because it didn't need darkness to hide. Bumpy Johnson sat in the back booth, the same one he'd occupied every Tuesday for 9 years, running numbers through a leather-bound ledger with the concentration of a surgeon. The jazz trio on the small stage played Coltrane, but quieter, stripped down to just bass and piano. The trumpet player hadn't shown up, and nobody seemed to mind. The music filled space without demanding attention, which was exactly what Bumpy preferred when he was working. Columns of figures marched down the pages in his precise handwriting, each entry representing a loan, a payment, a percentage, a promise kept or broken. Julius Gordon came through the side entrance at exactly 2:41, 11 minutes after Vinny Slick's hand connected with Maymie's face. Julius was 57, had worked for Bumpy since 1947, and understood the difference between information that required immediate delivery and information that could wait. He crossed the empty dance floor without rushing, his footsteps steady, his face carefully neutral. Bumpy didn't look up when Julius reached the booth. He finished writing a number, returned his pen to his jacket pocket with deliberate care, closed the ledger, and only then raised his eyes. The question was implicit in the gesture. Julius sat down without being invited, which was itself a signal. "Mamie's fine," Julius said first, because he knew that would be the only thing that mattered. "She's home, not hurt. But there was an incident at 1:15 on 125th. He laid out the facts with the precision of a court reporter, the location, the witness count, at least 17, the name Vincent Terranova, the words that were spoken afterward. He didn't editorialize, he didn't suggest a response. He simply delivered information, and then waited. Bumpy sat perfectly still for what felt like a full minute, but was probably closer to 20 seconds. His hands remained flat on the table, his breathing unchanged, his expression offering nothing. A younger man watching might have mistaken this for shock or indecision. Julius knew better. He'd seen this particular stillness before, most recently in 1958, when someone had tried to muscle in on the numbers racket using Bumpy's name without permission. That situation had resolved itself within a week, though resolved was perhaps too gentle a word. "Who saw?" Bumpy asked finally, his voice low and even, a tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Everyone," Julius replied. "Broad daylight, middle of the afternoon rush. Cecil was closest. The domino players saw the whole thing. Mrs. Patterson from the laundromat was across the street." He paused, then added the detail he'd been saving. 3 of Terra Nova's own people were on the next block. They saw their guy walk away laughing. Something shifted in Bumpy's eyes, a calculation being made behind a mask that revealed nothing. Where is he now? Back in Brooklyn, Carroll Gardens, probably bragging about it to anyone who'll listen. Julius hesitated, then took a risk. Tony Ducks doesn't know yet, at least. He didn't as of 20 minutes ago. Bumpy nodded slowly, processing angles and consequences with the methodical precision of a chess master looking 6 moves ahead. The obvious response would be immediate and violent. Send someone to Brooklyn tonight. Make an example. Re-establish the boundary that had just been crossed. It was what everyone would expect, what the streets would demand, what his reputation seemed to require. But reputation, Bumpy understood, was a tool, not a master. And tools were only valuable if you knew when to use them and when to build something better. I need you to do something for me, Bumpy said, his voice carrying a quality that made Julius lean forward despite himself. And I need you to do it without asking why, without telling anyone, and without leaving any trail back to this conversation. Julius nodded once. In 15 years, Bumpy had never abused that trust, never asked for something that wasn't necessary, never confused loyalty with exploitation. Get me a list, Bumpy continued, each word precise and measured. I want to know everywhere Vincent Terranova goes, his routines, his habits, where he eats breakfast, where his mother shops for groceries, what time his sister picks up her kids from school. I want to know his life from the outside in, the way a stranger would see it if they were paying very close attention. Julius felt something cold move through his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. He'd been around power long enough to understand that true violence wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was patient. It was the kind of thing that looked like nothing until you realized what was actually being built. How much time do I have? Julius asked. 48 hours, Bumpy replied. And Julius? He waited until their eyes met. Nobody gets hurt. Nobody gets threatened. Nobody even knows they're being watched. We're not collecting debt. We're collecting information. After Julius left, Bumpy sat alone in that booth for another 20 minutes. The ledger closed in front of him. The jazz trio playing something melancholy and minor-keyed. People who worked at Small's Paradise that day would later tell investigators that what stayed with them wasn't any dramatic reaction, any explosion of rage or promises of retribution. What stayed with them was the absolute stillness, the sense that they were watching someone make a decision that would change the architecture of power in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Anger, Bumpy understood, was a reflex. It was what your body did when control slipped. But calculation, real calculation that accounted for every variable and every consequence. That was power. That was the difference between making noise and making change. Rage announces itself and burns out fast, but silence builds pressure until the whole system has to adjust. A man isn't the weakness. His routines are. By Thursday morning, the file on Vincent Terranova was 3 inches thick and growing. Julius Gordon had done exactly what Bumpy asked, using a network of people who understood that some questions didn't need explanations. A cab driver who worked the Brooklyn routes, a woman who cleaned offices in Carroll Gardens, a kid who delivered groceries and remembered everything because nobody ever thought to tell him to forget. The information arrived in pieces throughout Wednesday, each fragment innocent by itself, unremarkable in isolation. Vincent bought his coffee at the same corner shop every morning at 7:15. 2 sugars, extra cream. His mother attended 8 o'clock Mass at Our Lady of Peace on Tuesdays and Fridays, always sitting in the 3rd pew from the front, His sister Maria picked up her two daughters from St. Agnes Elementary every afternoon at 3:30, usually stopping at Gino's bakery for bread on the way home. Bumpy read through each page in his office above Small's Paradise, the same office where he'd managed Harlem's underground economy for 3 decades. The space was modest, almost Spartan. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet that locked. No photographs, no memorabilia, nothing that suggested sentiment or nostalgia. The walls were bare except for a single calendar from a funeral home, a reminder that time passed and everyone, eventually, ran out of it. What made the file remarkable wasn't the information itself, but what it represented. Vincent Terranova's entire life, mapped out in habits and predictable patterns. The coffee shop where he joked with the owner, the barber who cut his hair every 3rd Saturday, the route he walked to his social club on Wednesday nights. Always the same streets, always the same timing. Moving through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never considered that being predictable might be dangerous. At 3 o'clock Thursday afternoon, Bumpy made a phone call that would later be discussed in whispers, though nobody could quite agree on the details. He called a photographer named Samuel Hirsch, a man who'd documented Harlem for 40 years, whose work hung in galleries downtown and whose discretion was absolute. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Bumpy explained what he needed, not why. Samuel asked 2 questions about lighting and timing, quoted a price that Bumpy agreed to without negotiation, and promised delivery within 72 hours. The second call went to a print shop in the Garment District, a place that specialized in high-quality albums and leather binding, the kind of work usually reserved for weddings and bar mitzvahs. Bumpy ordered a single album, burgundy leather, gold embossing, premium paper. He specified dimensions, page count, and a timeline that would require the shop to prioritize his order over everything else. When the owner started to protest the rush, Bumpy mentioned a name. Just one, and the protests stopped immediately. The third call was to a stationery store on Madison Avenue, a place that catered to old money and corporate executives who still believed in the power of a handwritten note. Bumpy ordered a single piece of correspondence paper. Heavy stock, cream-colored, no letterhead. He dictated 3 sentences to be written in calligrapher's script, each word carefully chosen. Each phrase designed to communicate something that couldn't be misunderstood. By Thursday evening, pieces were in motion that Vincent Terranova wouldn't know about for another 3 days. Components of a response that looked nothing like revenge because it was building towards something more permanent than violence. Bumpy sat in his office, the file open in front of him, studying not the information itself, but the patterns it revealed. The predictability, the assumption of safety, the complete lack of awareness that protection was a gift, not a right, and gifts could be revoked. Tony Dux Corallo received his own phone call Thursday night, though from whom he would never officially confirm. The conversation was brief and professional, the kind of discussion between men who understood that certain territories required certain protocols. Tony had been in the life long enough to recognize when someone was offering him a way to save face, and smart enough to understand that refusing would mean accepting whatever came next without complaint. "You've got a problem with one of your people," the voice on the phone said, not identifying itself because identification wasn't necessary. He stepped wrong on Tuesday, made it public, made it loud. Now it needs to be addressed before it becomes everyone's problem. Tony Dux listened to the details, his jaw tightening with each sentence, the anger building not at the caller but at Vincent, at the stupidity and carelessness that could jeopardize relationships that had taken years to establish. "I didn't authorize that," he said finally, which was both true and irrelevant. "I know," the voice replied, "which is why I'm calling you first. Tony, professional courtesy. But the situation still needs resolution, and it's going to get resolved one way or another. You can be part of the solution, or you can be part of the aftermath. Your choice. Chaos, the line went dead before Tony could respond, leaving him standing in his kitchen in Queens, the receiver still pressed to his ear, understanding with absolute clarity that something had shifted in the power structure that governed the 5 boroughs. Harlem wasn't asking for permission anymore. It was offering notification. And there was a profound difference between the two. Back in his office, Bumpy closed the file and locked it in the cabinet. The work was done now. The pieces were moving. What remained was simply waiting for Vincent Terranova to discover that protection wasn't a condition of existence. It was a negotiated agreement, and his had just been terminated without his knowledge or consent. In 72 hours, a package would arrive at his family's home, and everything that seemed solid and permanent would reveal itself to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. Old-timers in the neighborhood would later tell investigators that files like Bumpy's changed the whole game, proved you could control someone completely without ever loading a gun. But most people missed what really mattered in those pages. The dates, the times, the routes, all carefully documented as if they'd always been watched, as if privacy had been an illusion all along. To dismantle an empire, study how it operates when it thinks nobody's paying attention. The phone calls started Friday morning, and each one was a nail being driven into a coffin nobody could see yet. At 9:30, Bumpy's fingers dialed Samuel Hirsch Photography, the rotary clicking with mechanical precision in the silence of his office. Outside, Harlem was waking up to sirens and street vendors, but inside that room the air felt vacuum-sealed, pressure building before a storm. Samuel answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly from 40 years of unfiltered Camels, the kind of rasp that came from breathing in darkroom chemicals and exhaling secrets. "I need you to make ghosts visible," Bumpy said. No preamble, no pleasantries, just the raw statement of need. "I need photographs of people who don't know they're being hunted. I need you to document a family in Brooklyn, every move they make, every place they feel safe. I need you to prove that safety is just a story we tell ourselves before we go to sleep." Samuel's breathing changed on the other end, became shallower, more controlled. In the background, Bumpy could hear the tick of a darkroom timer, chemical smell almost tangible through the phone line. "You're asking me to build a case without a courtroom," Samuel said slowly, each word measured against some internal scale of morality that had been bending since 1938. "You want me to show someone that the walls they trust are made of paper and good intentions." "Exactly that," Bumpy confirmed, and something in his voice made Samuel's hand tighten on the receiver, hard enough that his knuckles went white, hard enough that his wedding ring bit into the flesh of his finger. "I want photographs that look like love at first glance. A mother at church, children leaving school, a man buying his morning coffee. But I want them sequenced so that when you see them together, you realize you're looking at a catalog of vulnerabilities, a menu of consequences that could have been ordered but weren't." The silence stretched for 15 seconds, long enough for Samuel to imagine his own mother's face in a surveillance photograph, long enough to taste bile at the back of his throat. 72 hours, he said finally. And Samuel. Whoever these people are, they're going to have nightmares for the rest of their lives about ordinary Tuesdays. You understand that? That's the point, Bumpy replied, and hung up before Samuel could change his mind or ask questions that didn't have comfortable answers. The second call went to Riverside Printing at 10:15. Douglas Chen answered with the careful politeness of a man whose family had survived the Japanese occupation of Shanghai by understanding when to bow and when to disappear. Bumpy ordered a leather album that would smell like money and taste like threat, burgundy with gold leaf that would catch light like a warning flare. I need it to feel expensive when someone holds it, Bumpy specified, his words precise as a surgeon describing an incision. I need the weight of it to communicate that whoever made this had resources, had time, had the patience to do this correctly. When someone opens this album, Douglas, I need their hands to shake not because of what they see, but because of what it cost to create. Can you source leather that still smells like the animal it came from? Can you make something that feels alive and dead at the same time? Douglas's pen scratched against paper, taking notes. And Bumpy could hear him breathing through his mouth now, the wet sound of a man whose tongue had gone dry. I can do that, Douglas said quietly. But Mr. Johnson, I've been binding books since 1949, and I can tell you that what you're describing isn't a presentation album. It's a tombstone for someone who's still walking around. That leather smell you want, that's the smell of something that used to be protected by its own skin. Monday afternoon, Bumpy said, ignoring the observation because acknowledging it would make them both complicit in something neither wanted to name directly. I'll send someone to collect it. Bill me triple your normal rate. I want you to remember this job. Douglas. I want it to sit in your mind like a stone you can't quite swallow. The third call made Julius Gordon, who'd been listening from the corner of the office, shift his weight uncomfortably. Martinelli & Sons Fine Stationery on Madison Avenue catered to people who thought $300 fountain pens were reasonable investments. An old woman answered, her voice carrying the brittle precision of someone who'd been taught that diction was a class marker. I need calligraphy that looks like it was written by someone's beloved grandmother, Bumpy explained, his tone conversational, almost warm, which made the content more disturbing than if he'd sounded threatening. I need script so beautiful it looks like a love letter, so formal it reads like a legal document. 3 sentences, and I need whoever writes them to understand they're creating something that's going to hang in someone's memory like a portrait of their own funeral. The woman's breath caught, a small sound like fabric tearing. Sir, we typically handle wedding invitations and birth announcements. What you're describing sounds like exactly what I'm paying for, Bumpy interrupted gently. Take down these words and write them in your most elegant hand. Are you ready? He didn't wait for confirmation. Your family is beautiful. They move through the world with such trust, such certainty of safety. That certainty is a gift I'm choosing to let them keep. The scratch of her pen was loud enough to hear through the phone line, sharp enough that Bumpy imagined he could smell the ink, that particular metallic scent that reminded him of blood before it dried. When she read the words back to him, her voice trembled on gift, that last word hanging in the air between them like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired yet. After she hung up, the woman would tell her grandson that she'd needed to wash her hands 3 times before they stopped feeling dirty, even though she'd only touched paper and ink. Julius stood up when Bumpy replaced the receiver for the 3rd time. You just commissioned a photographer, a bookbinder, and a calligrapher, he said, his voice carrying disbelief that bordered on awe. 3 artisans, 3 civilians who'll go home tonight and try to explain to their wives why they feel sick. You're not building violence, Bumpy. You're building something worse. You're building comprehension. Bumpy looked at him with eyes that had seen men die in alleys and watched politicians smile at funerals. Vincent Terranova put his hands on Maymee in broad daylight because he thought violence was the ultimate power. He said, each word landing like a judge's gavel. I'm going to teach him and everyone who works for Tony Ducks that violence is just noise. Real power is when you make someone understand how close they came to destruction, how thin the membrane is between their normal life and absolute chaos, and then you let them keep living with that knowledge eating them from the inside. By Friday evening, Word had spread through Harlem's network of barbers, bartenders, and numbers runners that Bumpy Johnson had spent the morning on the phone with people who had nothing to do with guns, drugs, or muscle. The confusion was intentional, the misdirection deliberate. Everyone expected bodies. Everyone anticipated retaliation that would paint Brooklyn streets the color of consequence. What they got instead was silence that felt heavier than gunfire, pregnant with implications that hadn't been born yet but were already moving in the dark. Men who'd worked enforcement for 20 years found themselves suddenly uncertain, realizing that the rules they'd learned, the patterns they'd relied on, might be obsolete now, replaced by something they couldn't quite name but could feel approaching like weather that changed the air pressure before the first drop of rain fell. Power announces itself through what it builds, not what it destroys. And the most terrifying constructions are the ones that look like gifts until you understand what they actually cost. The surveillance started Saturday morning at 7:30, and it moved through Brooklyn like cancer through tissue, silent and thorough. Samuel's photographer was a Korean War veteran named Marcus Webb, who'd learned patience in frozen trenches outside Chosin Reservoir, who'd discovered that staying still and watching could keep you alive when movement meant death. He sat in a Chevrolet across from Our Lady of Peace Church, with a Nikon F and a telephoto lens that could count the hairs on a man's knuckles from 200 feet. The camera smelled like machine oil and old leather, metal still cold from the trunk where he'd stored it overnight. Angela Terranova climbed the church steps at 7:47, exactly as the file predicted, her black handbag clutched against ribs that had carried 4 children and buried 1 husband. She wore a navy dress that had been expensive in 1954 sensible shoes that clicked against stone with the rhythm of routine. Marcus's camera captured her in profile as she reached for the brass door handle, her face showing that particular expression of peaceful anticipation that people wore when approaching places they considered sacred and safe. The shutter clicked 3 times. Mechanical whispers that Angela would never hear but would haunt her anyway once she saw the results. Marcus noted the time in his log, 7:47, 7:47, 7:48. 3 photographs that proved someone had been close enough to see the small gold cross at her throat, close enough to count the steps she took, close enough to do anything but had chosen documentation instead. He followed her routine like a doctor tracing the progress of disease through a body. The church on Friday, Saturday morning at Garibaldi's market, where she squeezed tomatoes and argued in Italian with the butcher about the quality of his veal. She bought meat wrapped in white paper that leaked pink at the corners, carried it in a canvas bag that strained against the weight. Marcus photographed her from across the street, shooting through a newspaper with a hole cut in the sports section, the kind of trick he'd learned from FBI agents during the McCarthy hearings. By Sunday, he'd moved to St. Agnes Elementary School, where Maria Terranova would arrive at 3:30 to collect her daughters. The playground smelled like asphalt baking in September sun, chalk dust and rubber from the kickball that bounced against the chain-link fence. Marcus positioned himself near a bodega, bought a coffee that went cold in his hand while he waited, watching mothers cluster near the entrance like birds at a feeder. Maria's blue Oldsmobile pulled up at 3:28, 2 minutes early, the kind of precision that spoke to anxiety disguised as efficiency. She wore a yellow sundress that showed her arms, tanned from a summer spent at Jones Beach. And when she smiled at the other mothers, Marcus could see the gap between her front teeth that her daughters had inherited. The camera caught her walking toward the entrance, caught her bending down when Sophia ran out first, caught the moment Grace emerged with paint on her hands and a drawing of a house with too many windows. 4 photographs. Sophia holding her mother's hand, her Mary Janes scuffed at the toes, Grace carrying a book bag decorated with cartoon mice, her knee scabbed from falling on the playground 3 days ago. Maria's face showing that unguarded joy that parents displayed when their children were safe and close and temporarily perfect. Marcus's stomach turned as he clicked the shutter because he had a daughter about Sophia's age. And he understood with sickening clarity that these photographs weren't about the subjects at all. They were about everyone who would see them later. Everyone who would understand that someone had stood this close to children and chosen restraint. Had made a decision that could be unmade. The documentation continued through the week with mechanical thoroughness that felt more invasive than violence. Vincent at Moretti's cafe each morning at 7:20, sitting at the same sidewalk table, reading the racing form while his espresso grew cold. His routine was so predictable that Marcus could have photographed him blindfolded, could have set his watch by the moment Vincent folded the paper and dropped exact change on the table before walking away. Wednesday evening. Vincent walked to the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, cutting through Columbus Park where old men played bocce ball and argued about whether Marciano could have beaten Joe Louis in his prime. Marcus followed at a distance, shooting from angles that captured Vincent's face in three-quarter profile, showing him relaxed and unguarded, moving through the world with the confidence of someone who believed his territory was secure and his family was untouchable. By Sunday night, Marcus had 73 photographs that mapped the Terranova family's existence with the precision of a military targeting assessment. He delivered them to Samuel's studio in a sealed envelope, refusing to look at the prints again because seeing them once had been enough. "These aren't surveillance photos," Marcus said quietly, setting the envelope on Samuel's desk like he was handling something contaminated. "These are receipts for violence that didn't happen. Every person in these pictures is going to spend the rest of their life looking over their shoulder, wondering if the watcher is still there." Samuel developed the prints himself, alone in his darkroom, watching faces emerge from chemical baths like ghosts manifesting in fog. The smell of fixer solution was sharp enough to make his eyes water. Or maybe that was something else. Some recognition that his craft had just been weaponized in ways he'd never anticipated. He'd photographed weddings where couples promised forever, and funerals where families buried their forevers. But these images felt different. Felt like he was developing evidence of a crime that hadn't been committed yet. That might never be committed, which somehow made it worse. Each print was mounted on premium stock and labeled with location, date, and time. No commentary, no explanation. Just the facts of observation, which carried more weight than any threat because they didn't need to threaten. They simply demonstrated capacity, proved that watching had happened and could happen again, that the membrane between private life and surveilled existence was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Veterans of the surveillance state, the ones who remembered what McCarthyism felt like when you were on the receiving end, recognized these photographs for what they really were: proof that privacy had always been permission and granted by those with power, and that permission could be revoked without warning or appeal. The terror isn't in being watched while you know it. It's in discovering you were watched when you thought you were invisible. When you believed the walls around your life were solid instead of transparent. The package arrived Tuesday morning like a diagnosis delivered in elegant handwriting. Terminal and absolute. 7:48, 3 minutes after Vincent left for coffee. The timing wasn't accidental. It was surgical. Designed so that Angela would be alone when she opened Pandora's box wrapped in burgundy leather and gold leaf. The delivery man wore a uniform that suggested legitimacy, carried a clipboard that implied bureaucracy, smiled with the professional courtesy of someone who had no idea he was delivering a psychological weapon. Angela signed with her married name, the signature shaky because arthritis made her knuckles swell in the morning, because she'd been kneading bread dough for 50 years and the repetitive motion had worn grooves in her bones. The package felt heavier than its physical weight suggested. had that density of consequence, that gravitational pull of something that would divide her life into before and after the moment she opened it. She carried it to the kitchen where Tuesday's coffee was still steaming, where the daily news sat unread with a headline about Cuba that seemed suddenly irrelevant. The brown paper wrapping smelled new, expensive, like department stores downtown where she never shopped because the salesgirls made her feel like her accent was a disease. She unwrapped it with careful hands, folding the paper out of Depression-era habit. And then the leather album sat on her Formica table like a snake coiled in beautiful packaging. The calligraphy on the interior page was so elegant it looked like something from a museum. Each letter formed with the kind of care that made the words feel more true, more permanent. Angela's reading glasses were upstairs, but she didn't need them for this. The sentences clear enough to read from across the room. Your family is beautiful. They move through the world with such trust, such certainty of safety. That certainty is a gift I'm choosing to let them keep. Her hands went numb, not metaphorically, actually numb. Blood draining from her fingers like her body understood before her mind did that she was holding evidence of violation, proof that the boundaries she'd trusted were fiction. She turned the page and saw herself climbing church steps, her face visible, recognizable, captured in a moment she'd believed was private because it happened in public, because she'd thought public meant anonymous, protected by the crowd. The second photograph showed her in profile, reaching for the door. The third caught her from behind, entering the sanctuary. 3 angles. 3 proofs that someone had been there, had known to be there, had chosen these specific moments to document. The timestamp underneath read, Friday, 7:47 a.m., and Angela's throat closed around a sound that wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a prayer, was something in between that tasted like copper and fear. She forced herself to turn the next page. Maria at the school, Sophia running out with her book bag bouncing against her spine, Grace with paint on her hands and joy on her face, that particular unself-conscious happiness that children showed before the world taught them to be careful. 4 photographs that said I could have been closer. I could have touched them. I could have done anything. But I chose to just watch. This time, Angela's coffee cup fell when her hand spasmed, ceramic shattering against linoleum, dark liquid spreading across the floor like blood, like prophecy. The smell of it mixed with her own sweat, with the leather album smell that was too organic, too animal, reminded her of the slaughterhouse where her father had worked when they first came from Sicily, that smell of things that used to be alive. The album continued through her family's week like a coroner's report on a body that wasn't dead yet. The grocery store, Vincent's morning coffee, Maria's routine drive. 73 moments when they'd moved through the world thinking they were safe, thinking that safety was default rather than granted, that protection was their right rather than someone else's choice. When Vincent came home 20 minutes later, smelling like espresso and newsprint and that particular male certainty that evaporated the moment he saw his mother sitting in spilled coffee with an open album and a face that looked like she'd just witnessed her own funeral. He didn't ask what was wrong. He picked up the album with hands that started shaking before he'd finished reading the first caption. Leafed through pages that documented his family's vulnerability with the thoroughness of a military intelligence assessment. Madonna, he whispered. The profanity transformed into prayer by the weight of comprehension. His face drained of color until he looked like a corpse, like someone who'd just realized they'd been dead for a week and nobody had bothered to tell them. They were at Sophia's school. They photographed my nieces. His voice broke on a truth too large to swallow. Someone had stood close enough to hurt what he loved and had chosen not to. Had demonstrated mercy in a way that felt more violent than any beating could have been. Angela stood up, her shoes squelching in coffee, and slapped her son across the face hard enough that his head snapped sideways. Hard enough that the sound echoed in the small kitchen like a judgment being delivered. "What did you do?" she asked, each word separate and distinct, carved from the kind of rage that mothers felt when their children endangered grandchildren. "What did you do that brought this into my house? That put pictures of my granddaughters in a book made by people who don't need to threaten because they've already proved they could reach us anywhere?" Vincent couldn't answer. The album sat between them on the table, still open to the photographs of Sophia and Grace, still smelling like expensive leather and careful planning, and the end of the safety they'd taken for granted their entire lives. Outside, Brooklyn continued its Tuesday morning routines, buses running, vendors selling, the world operating as if nothing had changed. While inside that kitchen, two people stood in spilled coffee and shattered certainty, understanding that the rules they'd thought governed their existence had just been rewritten without their consent or consultation. Relatives who visited the Terranova house in the weeks that followed would mention how the leather album never left the kitchen table, how it sat there like a centerpiece at family meals, unopened but present, a constant reminder that someone had been close enough to document their lives and might still be watching, might always be watching, that the safety they'd rebuild would forever be provisional, granted rather than guaranteed. The cruelest mercy is showing someone how easily you could have destroyed them and then walking away, because they'll spend every moment after wondering when you'll come back to finish what you started. The album hit Tony Ducks Corallo's desk like a coroner's report on a living body, and the sound it made, leather against oak, carried the finality of a casket closing. Tony's office in the Ravenite reeked of stale Partagas smoke and fear sweat baked into wood paneling over 30 years of confessions and death sentences. The air was thick enough to chew, dense with humidity from 12 bodies packed into a space built for 6. Vincent Terranova stood against the wall, his shirt soaked through at the armpits, dark crescents spreading like ink blots, his hands trembling so badly he'd shoved them in his pockets to hide the weakness. 3 capos sat at the table. Tony Ducks, whose nickname came from how many indictments he'd dodged. Sally Burns Granello, who'd earned his name by putting a blowtorch to a snitch's feet in 1951, and Christy Tick Fernari, whose right eyelid twitched whenever he was calculating whether someone needed to die. All 3 stared at the burgundy album like it was leaking radiation. Tony opened it with thick fingers that had broken noses and signed death warrants. The calligraphed note made his jaw muscles bunch like fists forming under skin. He read it once, twice. Then his hand slammed the table hard enough that coffee cups jumped, and Vincent flinched against the wall. "Your family is beautiful," Tony read aloud, his voice grinding like a transmission with blown gears. "They move through the world with such trust, such certainty of safety. That certainty is a gift I'm choosing to let them keep." Sally Burns leaned forward, his breath whistling through the gap where cops had knocked out 3 teeth with a phone book in 47. His face went the color of raw veal when he saw Angela Terranova climbing church steps, when he saw Maria's girls leaving school with paint on their hands and joy on their faces. "Mother of Christ," he whispered, and his hand went to his chest, pressing against his heart like he was trying to keep it from escaping his ribs. They were at the school. They photographed children. This isn't business, Tony. This is terrorism dressed up in family portraits. Christy Tick's eyelid started its spastic dance, 3 beats per second, a metronome counting down to violence or capitulation. He lit a lucky strike with shaking hands, the match flame guttering in air that felt oxygen-starved. "My nephew goes to St. Agnes," he said quietly, smoke leaking from his nostrils like a dragon too tired to breathe fire. Same 3:30 pickup, same playground. If they wanted to show us how exposed we are, how paper-thin our protection really is, they couldn't have picked a better knife to twist. Tony turned pages with mechanical precision, his breathing audible now, a wet rasp like emphysema or drowning. When he reached the photographs of Vincent's morning routine yesterday morning, 24 hours after the album was compiled, his face went rigid. "They're still watching," he said, each word dropping like a stone into water. "This isn't aftermath documentation. This is ongoing surveillance. They're telling us the cameras never turned off." Vincent's voice cracked when he finally spoke. Sounded like something being strangled. "Bumpy Johnson's wife bumped into me on 125th Street last Tuesday, and I reacted without thinking. Without understanding that putting my hand on her face was the same as putting a gun to my mother's head and pulling the trigger in slow motion over 8 days. The silence that followed had texture, had weight, pressed against eardrums like diving too deep too fast. Sally Burns stood up so violently his chair toppled backwards, crashed against the wall. The sound like bones breaking. He walked to the window overlooking Mulberry Street, where normal people bought bread and complained about traffic. Living lives that didn't include albums documenting their children's school routes. "You slapped Bumpy Johnson's wife," Sally said to his own reflection in the glass, his voice flat as a EKG reading on a corpse. "In Harlem, in daylight, in front of witnesses. And you thought what? Vincent. That your last name was body armor. That being Italian meant you could touch a black man's woman and walk away like it was nothing." Tony closed the album with deliberate care, the kind of gentleness you used handling explosives or terminal diagnoses. His eyes, when they met Vincent's, held no anger, no rage, just the cold assessment of a butcher deciding which cut would bleed fastest. "If Bumpy wanted you dead, you'd be decomposing in a Jersey landfill right now," Tony said, his voice conversational, almost kind, which made it more terrifying than screaming. "Your mother would be planning your funeral, not looking at photographs of herself buying vegetables. But he didn't kill you, Vincent. He did something worse. He showed us exactly how easy it would be. Documented every vulnerability, every unguarded moment. And then he left you alive to understand that your continued existence is his gift, not your right." Christy Tick ground his cigarette into an ashtray, twisting it like he was putting out an eye. "We have to respond," he said, but conviction had leaked out of his voice, left it hollow. "We can't let this stand. We can't let Harlem think they can photograph our families and face no consequences." "Consequences," Tony repeated, testing the word like it tasted rotten. "You want to talk about consequences, Christy? We send Muscle up to Harlem, rough up some photographer, lean on the print shop, make threats. And then what? Then we wake up and find our wives photographed buying groceries, our children documented walking to school. Every moment of trust transformed into evidence of vulnerability. And maybe next time, instead of photographs, it's actions. Maybe next time Bumpy doesn't choose restraint." The room absorbed that truth like a sponge absorbing blood. The red stain spreading until everything was contaminated. Vincent pressed his spine against the wall, felt the paneling bite into his vertebrae. Understood that he was watching his own professional execution conducted with words instead of bullets. Tony stood, picked up the album, carried it to the safe behind his desk where cash and insurance policies would now share space with evidence of defeat that tasted like survival. "Vincent, you're done in Harlem," he said, spinning the combination lock. "You're done with collections, done with enforcement. Done with anything that puts you north of Houston Street for the next year. Maybe forever. You're going to disappear into legitimate work until people forget your face, and Bumpy Johnson stops remembering how much restraint he showed your family. He locked the safe, the mechanism clicking like a revolver cylinder rotating, pocketed the key, turned to face his captains with eyes that had watched men die and learned nothing about mercy. And we're going to send word through channels that Harlem operates under new management protocols now. Not occupation, not partnership, his territory, completely. And we ask permission before we breathe his air. Men who drank in that social club during the months that followed would notice how conversations died when anyone mentioned Harlem. How Bumpy Johnson's name got spoken with the reverence usually reserved for cancer diagnoses or federal indictments. As if the album locked in Tony's safe had somehow rewritten the organizational structure of 5 boroughs without anyone signing new contracts or negotiating new terms. Sitting at that table, watching Tony lock away that album, everyone understood they were witnessing something historians would analyze for decades, the moment when traditional power acknowledged it had been outmaneuvered by someone who understood that documentation could be more devastating than destruction. The word moved through Brooklyn Thursday morning like cholera through a tenement, invisible and fatal, spread by whispers that felt like contagion. Nobody said Bumpy Johnson's name above a murmur. That was the brilliance of it, the strategic genius that made resistance impossible. Tony Ducks didn't call meetings, didn't issue proclamations, didn't create paper trails that federal prosecutors could subpoena. He simply made phone calls from booths where coins clinked and connections crackled. Had conversations over espresso in Carroll Gardens, where old men played briscola and pretended not to listen while absorbing every syllable. Carmine Persico got the word at his President Street social club while eating rigatoni that went cold in his mouth as he listened. The telling took 11 minutes. And Carmine didn't interrupt, didn't ask clarifying questions. Just let the story of the album flow into him like poison or revelation. When it finished, he set his fork down with the care of a man handling nitroglycerin, wiped red sauce from his lips with a napkin that came away looking like it had stanched a wound. "We don't operate up there anymore," Carmine said. 5 words that would echo through Brooklyn for a decade. Simple as commandments, absolute as physics. Not without clearance. Not without acknowledging that Harlem belonged to someone who just proved he could dismantle families without firing shots, without spilling blood that would attract federal attention or trigger wars that left everyone weaker. Paul Castellano heard it in his Tot Hill mansion, sitting in a study with views of water that looked like beaten pewter under December clouds. The messenger chose details carefully, precise about timestamps and terror. And when he finished, Paul poured Macallan 18-year that he didn't drink, just held while staring at boats moving through the Narrows like they knew where they were going. "The commission needs to understand this," Paul said to the window, to the water, to the future that was arriving whether anyone was ready. Not as intelligence, but as education. Because what Bumpy Johnson just accomplished changes every assumption we've operated under since Prohibition. He didn't challenge our strength. He made our strength irrelevant by fighting in dimensions we didn't know existed. The directive filtered downward with the inevitability of gravity or gangrene, corrupting old certainties, replacing them with new protocols nobody had voted on, but everyone would follow. Soldiers collecting from Harlem numbers, runners found their routes reassigned overnight. Territories compressed below 96th Street without explanation, beyond the whispered story of an album that proved safety was provisional. Protection was negotiated, and the power to destroy was most absolute when it remained unexercised like a loaded gun never fired. Friday afternoon. Julius Gordon walked into Dominic's restaurant in the Bronx where Lucchese captains met monthly to discuss business that couldn't survive daylight. He carried no weapons, needed none. Just a message from Bumpy that took 30 seconds to deliver. Mr. Johnson considers the matter resolved. No outstanding debts, no pending retribution. But Harlem operates under specific protocols now, and anyone wishing to conduct business there should request clearance 72 hours in advance through appropriate channels. The captains listened like men receiving terminal diagnoses, faces blank, but hands betraying them trembling slightly, reaching for drinks, touching faces in unconscious self-comfort. Angelo Maymee, made in 1941 survivor of 3 wars and 2 federal investigations, asked the question that mattered: what constitutes appropriate channels, and what does clearance actually mean? Julius's answer was bureaucratic poetry that established control without creating exploitable procedures. Communicate planned operations through me, Mr. Johnson reviews proposals and provides guidance on conflicts with existing arrangements. No conflicts. Operations proceed. Conflicts exist. Alternatives get discussed. This isn't taxation or tribute. This is coordination and respect for established relationships that predate your interest in the territory. Translation. Bumpy now controlled access to Harlem without demanding payment, without threatening violence, without doing anything that could be challenged through traditional negotiation or warfare. He'd established veto power over operations worth millions annually, and he'd done it by showing photographs of children leaving school, by proving that safety was gift he could revoke. Angelo nodded slowly, understanding spreading across his face like bruising after impact. "So we're acknowledging sovereignty," he said, not questioning. "We're accepting that Harlem isn't disputed or shared territory. It's his completely. And we operate as guests whose invitation can be revoked for violations we won't know about until after we've committed them." "Exactly," Julius confirmed. No apology in his voice, no negotiation in his posture. This was the new reality, and the only choice was accepting it gracefully or learning through pain that resistance cost more than compliance. The meeting ended without votes or formal agreements, but everyone who walked out understood that power structures governing New York's underworld had shifted tectonically. That fault lines had moved in ways that wouldn't become fully visible until years later, when investigators would identify this as the moment traditional organized crime acknowledged vulnerabilities they'd never imagined, threats they'd been too conventional to anticipate. Retired FBI agents reviewing surveillance transcripts from this period would note how wise guy conversations about Harlem changed overnight, how cavalier attitudes about territory became deferential requests for permission, as if someone had rewritten organizational manuals and distributed copies when the Bureau was looking elsewhere. Chasing murders and protection rackets while missing the real revolution happening in how power actually operated. By Saturday, every crew in 5 boroughs understood that Harlem had been transformed from contested territory into something else entirely. And the speed of that transformation, accomplished without bloodshed or negotiation, would be studied by power brokers for generations as proof that the most effective violence is the kind that never needs to occur. 3 months later, Vincent Terranova processed invoices in Sheepshead Bay, his life reduced to olive oil shipments and silence that never ended. The album lived in Tony's safe, but its legend metastasized through Brooklyn like cancer. Some versions claimed 200 photographs. Others swore it included bedroom shots, impossible angles suggesting supernatural surveillance. Truth didn't matter beside the lesson Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated power more absolute than murder by proving capability without exercising it. Maymee never discussed the slap, never gave interviews. She continued buying peaches from Cecil, walking Harlem with measured grace, protected not by her husband's violence, but by something more sophisticated psychological warfare that made killing redundant. Years later, young men would hear the album story as cautionary tale. Real power didn't announce itself through body counts, but through restraint that made violence unnecessary. February 1963. Exactly 1 year after the slap, Vincent understood the world had changed. He'd spent his life grateful for survival that looked like mercy, but was actually the most devastating demonstration of power imaginable. Back in Harlem, Bumpy closed his ledger, looked at 125th Street where life continued. The question hung unspoken: when you can destroy your enemy completely, do you exercise that power loudly, or demonstrate it quietly and let knowledge reshape the world? Federal investigators decades later would mark this period as a turning point they couldn't explain, as if fundamental rules governing power had been rewritten overnight, leaving traditional violence suddenly obsolete. If you held the power to end someone, would you choose immediate destruction or eternal dominance by letting them live, knowing you could revoke that gift any time? This story never appeared in any newspaper, not because it didn't happen, but because some truths make writers disappear before the ink dries. Tomorrow, we reveal what happened when someone ignored Bumpy's warning and the 5 families learned why silence is deadlier than bullets. Subscribe now for the stories they buried, the power moves they never reported, and the violence that rewrote American history from the shadows.